team at Oxford University that produced the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's become the workhorse of the government's programme, which has already vaccinated more than 11 million people. When I first spoke to her at the beginning of the year, she was quietly confident a vaccine could be found. Now those vaccines are being rolled out and we're gathering more and more data about their effectiveness, not least whether they work, above all, against the new variants. I asked her what the latest data showed.
We published a couple of new data sets this week, which is really good news on the use of the vaccine. Firstly, we showed that when people have the second dose at 12 weeks, the protection that they get, which starts from 3 weeks after the first dose of the vaccine, is maintained up until 12 weeks. So there's no gap in immunity between giving the first dose and giving the second dose. And then the people who have their second dose at 12 weeks end up with higher antibody levels and higher efficacy against the virus than people who have it with a short interval. So that's a really important finding, and that supports the use of the vaccine as 2 doses at a 12-week interval, which is how it's now being used in the UK. And then we published some more data from the UK showing that the efficacy against the new variant that's circulating, which is called B117, although it's also variously known as the Kent variant or the UK variant or the British variant, but against that virus, the efficacy wasn't diminished. So that's really good news as well. But we did see that the ability of antibodies induced by the vaccine to bind that virus did drop a bit. So that tells us that it's not all about the antibody titers. There are some other parts of the immune system that are helping to protect people against the virus when they encounter it. And then the other piece of information that we saw was the impact on the number of infections from the vaccination in our clinical trials. So we can think of COVID cases as a pyramid with the deaths at the top, the smallest number at the top, and then the severe cases, the hospitalizations, the mild cases, and the asymptomatic cases at the bottom, forming a pyramid. And there are 2 ways that the vaccine could affect the number of infections in that pyramid. One thing that could happen is that although the vaccine prevents severe disease, hospitalizations and deaths, it doesn't actually change the number of infections. So what we would see in that case would be more mild and more asymptomatic infections, but the total number would be the same and there would be no impact on transmission. However, that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing an alternative outcome, which is that the size of that pyramid is greatly reduced. It comes down to a third of its original size, and all of the cases that we then see are either mild or asymptomatic.
That is all clearly very good news indeed. But we're also in a situation now where the South African variant is beginning to spread around the country. So what do you know about the efficacy of the vaccine against that?
We're working with partners in different parts of the world to conduct our clinical studies and look at vaccine efficacy. And there will be more data to come out on this shortly. We've had safety data published from the South African trials, and it's been shared with regulators, and there are certainly no safety concerns. But that trial is quite a small trial, so there may not be much opportunity to look at impact on particularly something like severe disease.
Because we know that there's a study being published tomorrow which shows that your current vaccine only offers limited protection against the South African variant for moderate and mild disease. Could that have implications for how we live in the future, if that proves to be true?
What we're seeing from other vaccine developers is that they have a reduction in efficacy against some of the variant viruses, and what that is looking like is that we may not be reducing the total number of cases, but there's still protection in that case against deaths, hospitalizations and severe disease. So that pushes us more back to the first scenario with the pyramid of cases that I was talking about. Maybe we won't be reducing the number of cases as much, but we still won't be seeing the deaths, the hospitalizations and the severe disease. And that's really important for healthcare systems. Even if we're having mild and asymptomatic infections, to prevent people from going into hospital with COVID would have a major effect.
The median age of the study that I just quoted, I think, was 31, and we also know that vaccines quite often work less well against older people. So do we have the data to be sure that your vaccine will work among older people against the South African variant?
Well, that's something that's going to come out over time. At the moment, we don't have an intersection of a large number of cases of the South African variant in a population that we vaccinated, which also has a lot of older people in it. So it's not something we're going to be able to answer immediately.
When do you think you'll know about that? I know there's a lot more work to be done.
I think that's something that might have to be put together from a number of different studies. Unfortunately, we can't always answer all the detailed questions we want to from one single clinical study.
Now, we know that you're already tweaking and reworking the vaccine to cope with new variants. Have you got a version ready yet that would take on the South African vaccine virus?
We have a version with the South African spike sequence in the works. It's not quite ready to vaccinate people yet, but as all the developers are using platform technologies, these are ways of making a vaccine that are very quick to adapt. So last year, all of us took our platform technology, whether it was an adenoviral vector vaccine or an RNA vaccine, and we slotted in the gene for the spike protein that was the one that was common at that time. And this year, we're doing the same again. So it's easy to adapt the technology, develop a new virus, which will have to go through a small amount of clinical testing, not nearly the same amount that we had to do last year. This year, we expect to show that the new version of the vaccine will generate antibodies that recognize a new variant. And then it will be very much like working on flu vaccines. So people will be familiar with the idea that we have to have new components, new strains in the flu vaccine every year to keep up with the main flu strains that are circulating. And there are regulatory procedures that are well established for that. It's called a strain change, and vaccine developers know how to go through that process. So we'll be following that process again in future for the coronavirus vaccines.
So you can work fast and the regulators can work relatively fast, but then of course you have to manufacture the vaccine and get it out. Do you think this new version of the vaccine will be available, for instance, for the autumn?
Yes, it looks very much like it will be available for the autumn. We're already working on the first part of the manufacturing process in Oxford. That will be passed on to other members of the manufacturing supply chain as we go through the spring, and it looks very much likely that we can have a new version ready to use in the autumn.
So does that mean that people watching can expect there to be a big vaccine program with boosters in the autumn, and perhaps that could be the same as the second dose?
We're waiting to gather the information that we need to make those decisions. At the moment, it's all about being prepared. So last year, I started working on the vaccine against coronavirus as soon as I saw the first reports of cases coming out of China, not knowing if we actually needed to have that vaccine, but knowing that if we did need it, we would need it quickly. And we're taking the same approach now. We're getting prepared with different versions of the virus, and we'll be ready if we need to use them.
If this South African variant carries on spreading, and if it's harder to prevent mild and moderate illness until we can get to the boosters in the autumn, what does that mean for the way we behave over the summer and in the interim?
We're going to need to keep a really close eye on the spread of the South African variant in the UK. Obviously, that's something that's happening now, but with the rollout of the vaccine programme going so well, I hope that we'll be able to get ahead of that.
And will this mean, therefore, for instance, we'll have to carry on socially distancing for a bit longer while this is still spreading?
Well, that's not my field of expertise. My job at the moment is to make new versions of this vaccine to be ready if we need to use them, and that's what I'm concentrating on.
Now, the other variant that people are talking about already, not here in any numbers yet, is the Brazil variant, and people are very concerned about that. What are you doing about that, and are you looking at yet another version of the vaccine to cope with that?
Yes, we have multiple different versions in the works at the moment, so that we'll be able to make a choice later. There are some similarities between the different variants that are circulating now, but our best plan is to have a number of different options to choose from.
One of the other things that we've heard is that actually mixing and matching the different vaccines can provide higher protection. So you get a first dose of AstraZeneca and then a second dose of Pfizer, or vice versa. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's something that I've worked on for many years in other vaccine development programs. We call it heterologous prime boost immunization, and that just means giving a different vaccine encoding the same antigen for the first and for the second vaccination. And it does tend to give higher immune responses and better protection. So obviously it's something now that we want to look at. Now that there are more than one licensed coronavirus vaccines available using different technologies, but with the same antigen, the spike protein, it's a really good opportunity to put that into a research study and look at whether we do indeed get higher immune responses. It wouldn't be at all surprising if we do.
It's really interesting. You were saying that delaying the second dose can actually increase protection. But is it important that the second dose comes within the 12 weeks that the regulatory authorities have stipulated?
It could probably be a little bit longer than 12 weeks. I don't expect to see any rapid drop-off after 12 weeks. We do recommend that people have the second dose because that's likely to give them much longer-term immunity, and that's what we want to have. So definitely do have the second dose, but don't be too worried if it's 13 weeks rather than 12. I really don't think that's going to make any difference.
It's perhaps unfair to ask you this, but the Pfizer vaccine is supposed to be given within 3 weeks, and a lot of people are worried that anything beyond 3 weeks will be a problem for them. As an outsider, I suppose, in a way, what's your view of that?
Well, we know that immunity after vaccination to any vaccine builds up in the first 3 weeks, and it can still increase after that even if you don't revaccinate. And then it doesn't suddenly disappear overnight. You don't suddenly drop off a cliff edge of immunity just because you've got to 3 weeks after the first vaccination. So I wouldn't be particularly concerned. Obviously, we would like to see some data to reassure us, but I wouldn't be particularly concerned that after waiting for a second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, there would be any deleterious effect.
Now, President Macron famously said that your vaccine was only quasi-effective in the over 65s, and a lot of people piled in and criticised him for that. But since then, Germany, France, Switzerland and Poland have all decided not to give your vaccine to over 65s. What do you think is going on there?
Well, they're saying that they would like to see more data in the over 65s, and that will be possible to provide once the US trial reaches its efficacy readout. But it's not data that we have currently from the UK trial. We did have older adults enrolled in the UK trial, and we had safety and immunogenicity data, but a very limited amount of efficacy data because they were enrolled somewhat later in the study, and also they were obeying guidelines and being very cautious, and they weren't going out and getting infected with coronavirus. So that means that we don't have data on how well the vaccine works. If the people in the control group aren't getting infected, we can't tell if the people in the vaccinated group would have been protected. So what's happening is in Europe, they do have other vaccines that are available, and so they're able to decide if they want to use different vaccines in different age groups. However, we will have data in future showing how well the vaccine works in older people.
Is there going to be a time in the future when your vaccine finds itself ineffective against a new mutation, and what do you do then?
It's very unlikely that vaccines would become completely ineffective. The spike protein that we use in the vaccine is quite a large protein. Part of the protein is involved in binding to the receptor on cells and getting inside the cell, and that's where the mutations are tending to happen. But the rest of the protein has to maintain the same structure, and so other components of the immune response, the T-cell response in particular, will still recognize the spike protein and be able to destroy the cells that are infected with the virus and stop the infection from spreading through the body. So a really extreme mutation in the coronavirus would be to lose the spike protein altogether, and that's the antigen that we have in the vaccines, so then we wouldn't have an immune response against it. But of course, such a virus would be completely non-functional. It wouldn't be able to infect cells in the body, it wouldn't be able to make more copies of itself, and so that's not a mutation that's ever going to arise and spread among the population. So it's not one that we would need to worry about.
Well, that is a very, very interesting and, dare I say, cheering thought to end on. Professor Gilbert, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.